Chapter 11. I watched the camp for 6 days. To begin with, I used the knoll as my base, and by the time I was through, I'd even made the place halfway comfortable. An extra ground sheet, rigged between 2 cedars, kept off the rain, and wrapped inside a sleeping bag with a couple of butane camp stoves angled to reflect their heat off a big rock, I stayed reasonably warm. My meals were sandwiches and dare cookies, and I replaced my canteens of wine with a thermos of coffee and brandy, and I improved things on the optical side with a 20-power Zeiss telescope. So conditions were passable, if not exactly cozy. I soon developed a routine. I left my motel around 5 every morning, and was normally blundering through the bush as dawn dribbled over the horizon. On the knoll by 7, I'd bundle myself in my sleeping bag and watch the mist uncoil over the stream or a few straggling ducks. Their necks stretched out before them, beat a nasty retreat down the valley from Canada. My first sighting usually came around 8. One of them would step onto the veranda with green plastic bowls for their dogs. Sometimes hours then passed before I saw them again. Boredom was as much a problem as anything. My first coffee break, a great event, was at 10. I munched my sandwiches at noon, then there was more coffee at 2. I always left by 4:15. I didn't want to get caught in that bush after dark. What did I gain by all this? Not much. Traven had known everything. Traven had known why Brightman had died. Thus, having traced Traven this far, I assumed that I would know too, that I'd make the final connection between Brightman, Dimitrov, the adoption of May, and the eruption of all these events into the present. In fact, what I now discovered seemed to lead in a completely different direction. Sitting up on that knoll, half frozen, I knew that the people I watched through my telescope were connected to Brightman, but the hows and whys now seemed to evaporate. Still, I did gather some data. There were 5 men, no women, staying at the camp, and with the help of the telescope, I soon learned to distinguish them. The red-haired man, the one I'd seen in Brightman's house, was obviously the leader. Twice I saw him ordering the others about, gesturing, pointing, and they obeyed him without hesitation. But it was equally clear that he wasn't running a hunting camp. Their one visitor came on the 3rd day. I watched him, but he was wearing a suit and left after an hour. By that time, the 3rd day, I was frustrated. My expectation in Washington, that I was on the brink of a solution, had now retreated into the distance, yet I wasn't sure what to do. Getting closer to the camp wasn't the answer. With the telescope, I could see well enough. The trouble was, what I wanted to see wasn't the sort of thing you ever do see. Plans, relationships, motives. I thought of breaking into the house and searching it, but on top of all the other risks, and I wasn't sure I had the nerve, there was the problem of the dogs. These were nothing special, just a couple of sheepdogs, but they were clearly turned out of the house every night to guard it. That 3rd night, back in my motel room, I decided on something simpler, to follow them when they left the camp in their cars. From the start, I'd observed them departing on a number of such expeditions. Most had an obvious purpose, carting their garbage to the dump, buying groceries, but others were less clear, and they were frequent enough to arouse my curiosity. For example, on the 2nd day the red-haired man took off in the Sirocco just after 9 and still hadn't returned when I came down from the knoll. Where had he gone? What had he done? Following them was the easiest way to find out, and I tackled the problem on the 4th morning, hunting for a spot on RFD2 where I could keep the gate under observation. I found one, though it wasn't very good. Because of the way the road curved, I had to be almost on top of the gate to see it, and because there was virtually no shoulder here, my car wasn't even remotely hidden, which meant I had to stay very alert to avoid being seen. As soon as someone came down the camp road, I'd pull out, as if I was just passing by, and then watch in my mirror to see which way the car turned. I almost never timed this properly. I'd be around the first curve before the driver got out of the car, opened the gate, and emerged onto RFD2. Because of this, I'd drive very slowly, waiting to see if he came into sight. If he did, I'd drive on normally, and he'd usually pass me. If not, if he turned in the other direction, I'd have to make a fast U-turn and chase after him. All of this sounds clumsy, but it worked. Over the next 3 days, I followed them on 7 separate trips away from the camp. On 4 occasions, I broke away quickly. I was afraid they might spot me, but the other 3 times I was able to stay with them to their destination. All of these excursions were completely mundane. I only learned anything of significance from one of them. They bought groceries, gas, stamps. They took their clothes into the cleaners. The Sirocco was repaired at Al's garage, despite its enormous sign, "We specialize in Jap cars," and they picked up a cord of wood from a farmer near Gorham, a little place about 10 miles south of Berlin. None of this was very enlightening, though I was rather more comfortable than I'd been up on that knoll. But then, on the 5th day, the pickup took their trash to the dump, and I decided to do a little garbage picking. No one saw me. The dump, up a short access road, was just an open spot in the bush. There was a wooden shack, presumably for an attendant, but that morning I only had 2 hopping crows for company. I could see where the truck had parked, and 3 yellow garbage bags had been tossed nearby. Making like a real CIA man, I began poking through them, thereby discovering that garbage is garbage. Orange rinds, eggshells, milk cartons, yuck. But the last of the bags contained newspapers, and there I found something. In among the New York Times and Boston Globes were 2 old copies of a Russian-language paper, Nasha Strana, Our Homeland. I'd actually heard of it, though I'd never seen a copy before. It was published in Buenos Aires and served the large Russian émigré population there. Both issues were a couple of months old, the paper yellowed and cracked, and though I sat in the car and read them through from beginning to end, I couldn't see anything of particular interest. Nonetheless, it established something important. Traven's connection to the camp hadn't been casual. An hour later, I made another discovery, also important, even if I couldn't say precisely what its significance was. I was back in my regular position by the side of the road when a plumpish woman in an old Toyota pulled up by the gate and delivered the U.S. mail. 1 envelope slipped into their box. As soon as she left, I did the obvious thing. The mailbox was an old one, and though it had a lock, this had long since been broken. The envelope, standard size, was fat, heavy, crinkly. I shoved it into my pocket and headed straight back to the motel. When I opened it, I discovered 3 items, a wad of receipts stapled together, 20 $100 bills, and a letter from a lawyer in Springfield, Massachusetts. This was addressed to Mr. Howard Peterson, C.O. Gary's White Mountain Camp. It itemized all the paid bills, noted that your usual remittance is enclosed, and concluded, after these transactions, your funds held in trust by this firm amount to $22,736.79. It was signed, as per the letterhead, by one Robert Evans. Robert Evans, whose name was on the camp's deed. Interesting. I flipped through the receipts. They included everything from a county tax bill to an American Express account. The local items were all charged to the camp, the others to something called E. Arnott Travel Ltd. In the case of the Amex account, this might even have been genuine. It certainly included plenty of trips. Boston to Montreal, Montreal to Toronto, Toronto to New York, Boston to London, Amsterdam to Frankfurt, Brussels to New York. During this previous month, Mr. Peterson had been moving around and taking certain precautions to cover his tracks. He either hid behind his lawyer or paid him in cash, and indeed it occurred to me now that I'd never seen any of them take a trip to the bank. It was 3 o'clock when I made this discovery. Given the sum of money involved, I assumed that Mr. Peterson was expecting his letter, so I drove straight to Springfield and put it back in the mail. It was late by then, so I stayed overnight and didn't head back to Berlin till the next morning. That was a dreary drive. I had no idea where I stood. Something was going on, and Berlin was one of the centers. But Brightman, Dimitrov, and Traven revolved around it like unknown mysterious planets. Above all, I couldn't see where Traven fitted in. Presumably he'd been living at the camp. Did the people there know what had happened to him? Or had Traven been a renegade, whom they themselves had eliminated? This had to be admitted as a possibility, but if I accepted it, I had to reject my previous theory, that the people who had dealt with Traven and searched the hotel room were official, but they had been. I was sure of it, which meant that I was dealing with 2 sets of Russians, the KGB, the men who'd killed Traven, and the people I was watching right now. But who could they be? A good question, which I couldn't answer. Yet, as I drove along, I wondered if I didn't have a few clues. They were Russian, they were apparently an organized group, and they might have émigré connections. Witness the paper I'd pulled out of the garbage. What seemed to tie these facts together, albeit with a tenuous thread, were some of the remarks Traven had made on the phone in Detroit. At the time, I'd barely noticed them, but now they came back into my mind. "We can talk about the bully me," Traven had said, or the Begani or the Black Hundreds. I'd taken him to mean we can talk about anything under the sun, but perhaps he'd revealed more than he intended. The Bulani are the great medieval folk epics of Russian literature, and their most famous hero, Ilya of Murom, has long been a symbol of Russian power, Russian unity, Russian Christianity, and the greatness of Russia's common man. The Beguni, if I remembered correctly, were a crazy 19th century religious sect, the word means fugitive, who refused to have anything to do with authority, especially the census and passports, and took to the woods like Robin Hood. And of course the Black Hundreds were a group of anti-Semitic thugs with connections to the Tsarist court, whose program was embodied in the protocols of the Elders of Zion. At this point, you could even make a direct connection to myself. The protocols were ostensibly the outline of a Jewish plot to conquer the world by subversion. In fact, they'd been concocted by the Russian secret police around 1900 and had continued to be important in anti-Semitic propaganda into the 30s and even later. For in September 1972, the Soviet embassy in Paris had actually issued one version of them, word for word, as a document entitled "Israel, a School of Obscurantism." I'd been in Paris at the time, had written a piece on it, and in consequence hadn't been able to get a visa back to Moscow for the next year. Could all that be connected? Was it possible that Traven, without meaning to, had hinted that these people were some sort of wild immigré sect, Russian and religious, anti-Semitic and anti-Soviet? There was no reason why this shouldn't be true. In fact, there are Russian immigré groups like this all over the world. But what was the connection to Brightman, to Dimitrov, to May, and why did the KGB take it so seriously that they were prepared to murder its members inside the United States? When I arrived back in Berlin, I had no idea what the answers to these questions might be, and not much certainty that the questions themselves made any sense. In fact, I didn't have any ideas at all, and later that afternoon, when I returned to my customary position near the camp gate, I was really admitting that I couldn't think of anything better to do. I got there about 3:30, and for the next couple of hours bored myself with the futility of my own thoughts. But finally, as dusk began to concentrate into full night, headlights swept over the gate. A man emerged, his shadow stretching over the road. The red-haired man. I could now tell them apart by their shape, bearing, stance. But there was someone else in the car with him, which made me curious, for I'd never known them to travel in pairs. It was the short, stocky one, who usually drove the pickup, but now I was well into my trick, pulling out and heading up the road, and once again I hadn't timed it right. 40 seconds passed. There were still no lights in my mirror, so I U-turned and doubled back. The road was empty, but as I came through the curve, I could see their taillights way up ahead. They were driving the Sirocco and traveling fast, away from Berlin toward Route 26. This wasn't the usual pattern. Most of the time they headed for town, but then I'd never before followed them this late in the day. We came up to the highway, left turn north, which was also rare, as the road twisted into the hills. I fumbled along the dash for my map. North of here was a place called Colebrook, very small, then the Vermont border, then Canada. The highway curved and climbed higher, then swooped down through Dixville Notch. Hanging on to the wheel, I kept my mind on my driving. The Sirocco sprinted ahead, your glorified rabbit, while my Ford drifted clumsily through the curves and grumbled up grades. Still, the further we went, the more content I was to hang back. On a road with so many hills and curves, it was unlikely that they'd spot me, but there was no sense taking chances, especially since there were so few places where they might turn off. Even so, I almost made a mistake. We passed through Colebrook, where I closed up a little, and the border, 8 or 10 miles beyond, came up quicker than I expected. The border post here is very small. Canaan on the U.S. side, a tiny Quebec village, whose name I never did learn, on the Canadian side. So there's just one small hut and a single guard. I only realized what was happening at the very last minute. If I hadn't pulled over, I would have been sitting right behind their car as they went through. As it was, I gave them 5 minutes before coming up, and they were just pulling away as I arrived. Once I was cleared, I took after them. The road here was gravel, twisting along the shore of a lake, and no matter what you were driving, you couldn't go very fast. No one seemed to live in this district. There was an abandoned farm, a few scruffy cottages, the Christian frontier camp. At last I bumped up onto asphalt, and then I picked up their lights. They led me to a town called Kotikuk, then further west along the same narrow road. There were hills in the distance, big lumps of darkness, but rolling countryside stretched away on either side of the double-barreled sweep of headlights. Now there were more houses and farms whose flood-lit silos were painted with the blue fleur-de-lis. I hung back. There wasn't much traffic, and when the Sirocco turned down a still smaller road, I put out my lights. The night was like ink, driving blind. I edged out to the center line, guessing the curves by the twitch of their taillights. Entering woods, we started to climb. I had to slow down, but every time they went around a curve, I flicked on my lights and shot ahead, before dousing them again. Finally, a mile further on, they swung right. I slowed right down, watching them cross an open field. Their lights poked down this side road about 200 yards and then stopped, and then backed up a bit before turning sharp left. That had to mean a house or farm. I waited till they were gone and then followed, my wheels crunching over the gravel. Passing the spot where they turned, I could see a lane leading up through some trees with a glimmer of light just beyond. Keeping straight on for 100 yards or so, I backed around and pulled over. With the motor idling, I rolled down my window. A soft rustling night spread around me. The air was cool, full of the smell of grass and wet earth. After those miles in the dark, I needed a break and lit up a cigarette. But as soon as my nerves had knit back together, I got out of the car. Silently, staying on the grass at the edge of the ditch, I walked up to the lane. There was a mailbox, of course. I wondered if the things wouldn't haunt my dreams in future years as banal symbols of hidden identity. This was an old one, with a name crudely painted in red, N. Barry. I went up the drive a few steps, but all I could see was a vague pattern of lights beyond some maple trees. My nose quivered then. There was an odd, strange smell in the air. Presumably this place was a farm, but it wasn't manure. Chickens, pigs. It was different, stronger, something like skunk, but not that either. The breeze shifted, the smell wafted away. I hesitated. I wanted to go further down the road, but I knew I couldn't. The 2 men in the Sirocco plus this N. Barry that made it 3 against 1, and if they caught me skulking around, what explanation could I possibly give? I went back to the ford. An hour passed. Then around 8:30 a terrible howl cut through the night, ending with the most pitiful whimpering sound I'd ever heard in my life. It was so sudden and startling that it froze me in my seat. Staring into the blackness, I leaned forward and switched off the engine, listening as silence hummed in my ears. Then a dog barked, except like that smell, it wasn't quite that. It was different, a quicker, sharper yip. And then another barking voice joined in, and then another, and for the next 25 minutes didn't stop. The helpless, desperate baying of terrified animals pacing back and forth in their runs. It went on, cries of pain and fear and lamentation that made my skin crawl with horror. But what had happened, and what could I do? Maybe I should have done something, but I didn't. I just sat there and waited. Then headlights swept down the lane. The Sirocco, as it paused at the end of the drive, I had a glimpse of 2 shadowy figures inside. One of them was the red-haired man from the camp. Then the car turned and headed back toward the highway. I watched till their lights finally winked out in the distance. Half of me, I admit, wanted to follow them, but I couldn't. I felt bad enough as it was, and to have driven away from that pitiful howling would have left too much on my conscience. So I started the Ford and moved up the road. As I turned into the drive, stones popped under the tires and trees flashed silver in the glare of my headlights. For 50 yards the lane was black as a tunnel, and then it curved around in a crescent, and a lawn gleamed like black ice. I could see the house then, and every light in the place seemed to be on. It was a small bungalow, not much more than a cottage, the roof slanting steeply over a small front porch. Bright fans of light spread out from 2 windows, but everything else was in shadow. As my headlights came around, I could see that the space between the porch and the ground was filled in with white painted lattice. Shovels and rakes were leaning against this. A wheelbarrow, filled with dead leaves, stood just at the end of the drive. I stopped the Ford, but kept the engine running, and then blew the horn a couple of times. The crying and barking grew even louder, but no one came out of the house. Very reluctantly, I stepped out of the car, and then waited a moment, one hand on the top of the door and one foot inside. For a moment, I stared at the house, over the roof of the car, reached in and blew the horn again, but still no one came. Beneath the grisly howling of the dogs, or whatever they were, night sounds whispered, and the cool air traced my cheek. The musky odor I'd smelled before was now very strong, but I still couldn't decide what it was. Closing the car door softly, I stepped around the hood, paused again, and then went straight up to the porch. There was a metal storm door. I knocked, and it shook with a rattle, but by now I was sure that no one was coming, so I eased it open, and then I saw that it was slightly ajar, and I just pushed it ahead of me. Standing on the threshold, I looked into a small, brightly lit room, a cottage room. It was crammed with the sort of old furniture that collects in such places: a clumsy sofa, a white wicker chair, a heavy square armchair from the 50s, floor lamps with tasseled shades. But this wasn't what I looked at, not then. Directly in front of me, on the other side of the room, was an arch leading into the kitchen beyond, and in the middle of this space, lashed into a straight-backed chair with a rope, was an old man, but pulled over his head like a sack was the head and shoulders of a fox, a white fox, whose lips were pulled back, grinning in death. The other half of its body was lying beside the chair, its guts bulging out of it in a bluish-pink mess, with the axe that had been used to sever the neck driven into the floor just beside it. Blood was everywhere. The room stank of it. It was matted like paint in the fox's fur. It glistened around the legs of the chair. Great black stains had soaked into the carpet. I sucked in a breath, but a breath whose stench made me choke it off in my windpipe. I wouldn't say that I'm squeamish, but God only knows why I didn't pass out at the sight of this. Maybe, after Detroit, I was ready for anything, or maybe the cruelty of the scene twisted the horror I felt in anger. In any case, my shoes skidding in gore, I crossed the room to the old man. He was alive. With a convulsive jerk, I flung the fox's head away, and for the first time he must have known I was there, for he started to struggle, almost overbalancing the chair. I caught him. He was shaking with fear, and as I reached around behind him to get the ropes, he started to whimper. They were going to kill them all, just like that. They said they'd kill them all one after the other. I coughed. If I coughed, I might not have been sick. My hands, slick with blood, tugged at the ropes. The old man kept whimpering. The foxes kept howling. "It's okay," I finally said, getting him free. "It's okay. They're not going to kill anyone now, Mr. Barry. You're all right. Listen, I'm a friend. Do you understand that? I'm a friend." I took him by the shoulder and eased him a little away from me. "I was a friend of Harry's," I said, "Harry Brightman's." At last something flickered in his eyes. "Poor Harry," he whispered. "Things never end like you think."